This presentation, we will cover residential, including single family to quads. What this presentation does is it builds on the introductory session where we covered the structure and layout of Indy Rezone. As in the first presentation, you can follow along with this presentation with your copy of Indy Rezone. And like in the first presentation, when you see a box with page numbers on it, the first page number is for the footnoted version, and the second page number, which is in italics, is for the non-footnoted version. When you're talking about residential districts, and in particular single-family units, you think back to how our old district, our old ordinance was set up. In the old ordinance, we identified only these types of housing units: single family, double, multifamily, plus mobile homes, manufactured home, and group homes. In the new ordinance, we have an expanded listing of housing units. We have single family detached, single family attached, two-family dwelling, triplex, fourplex, live-work unit, a secondary dwelling unit, and multifamily, plus the mobile home, manufactured home, and group home. This expanded list is much more contemporary. It covers the types of housing units we are constructing in Indianapolis. Now, our zoning ordinance reflects that modern aspect of construction. As we're talking today, we want to make sure we have a common understanding of some of the key terminology. We use the term dwelling unit, and it is defined in Indy Rezone. And that is one or more rooms connected together in a residential building or a residential portion of a building that are designed for occupancy by one common household. They may be owner-occupied, they may be leased, but it is a unit for a single household. So when you're talking about a single-family detached dwelling, that has a specific meaning. It is a building designed for residential occupancy by one family on a lot or parcel containing no other primary building. So there is just a single dwelling unit on that lot or parcel. That's distinguished from a single family attached dwelling. The key difference in this is that each dwelling unit is attached to another dwelling unit, but each dwelling unit is on its own legally established lot or is part of a condominium. The dwelling units are completely separated from each other by an unpierced wall extending from ground to roof, or an unpierced ceiling and floor extending from exterior wall to exterior wall. That is to say, there is no common connection across the units. When we're talking about single-family attached dwelling units, the last provision is important. This use does not include a secondary dwelling unit. We're talking about primary dwelling units for single-family attached. The next key definition is a two-family dwelling, also known as a double or duplex. This is where you have two dwelling units that share a common wall, are connected to each other, but they are completely separate from each other. A key provision on the double or two-family dwelling is that each dwelling unit may be on the same lot or they can be on separate lots. That's a key distinction. The important thing to remember is that with a double, they are completely separated from each other by an unpierced wall. The next key definition is a triplex, also known as a triple. And this is a building that's designed for 3 families, 3 dwelling units. Each legally complete dwelling unit is separated from the other, and none of the 3 units are located on a separate lot. All 3 units must be located on a single lot to qualify under the definition of a triplex. Again, each of the units is completely separated from the other by an unpierced wall, so that there is no common access across units. This use also includes townhomes or larger residences that are split into 3 separate dwelling units. The next key definition is the fourplex, also known as a quad. This one has 4 legally complete dwelling units. And again, the important distinction, no dwelling unit may be located on a separate lot. All 4 dwelling units are on a single lot. And again, each unit is completely separated from the other by an unpierced wall. So that distinguishes the fourplex, the triplex, the single family attached, single family detached, and the double. Each has a unique definition. In Indy Rezone, we've also acknowledged a new type of dwelling unit, and that is what we call the live-work unit. A live-work unit is one that contains an integrated living and working space within the unit, and it has shared access across the living and working space. It's generally intended to serve predominantly as business workspace with residential use as an incidental use. Now, more often than not, the workspace is found on the ground floor of the unit, and the residential part is located either on an upper floor or at the back of the unit. That is not a requirement, but that is typically how these live-work units are designed. But we are treating this as a distinctly different type of dwelling unit because it combines both living and working space into a single unit. In that list of dwelling units that we have under Indy Rezone, we are adding a new term, and that is a secondary dwelling unit. And that's defined as a dwelling unit, a complete residential unit that is subordinate and accessory to a single-family detached dwelling. So that means it has to be smaller than the single-family detached unit, and it is secondary to that unit, smaller and detached from that single-family unit. We'll talk more about the secondary dwelling unit later on in this presentation. So we've gone through the definitions of all these different types of housing units. As I noted earlier, it's more complex than the old ordinance. You now see how we have a greater distinction across the types of housing units. And what that translates into is a greater difference between lower density and higher density dwelling districts. That's because there are different types of housing units permitted in each of them. Another change is that some of these housing types that we just went through are now permitted in non-residential districts. So it's more complex, greater distinction across housing types, and some of them go across non-residential districts. So how do you know where can this unit be placed? The answer is in the use table. What you see before you now is an excerpt from the use table in Indy Rezone. This is the listing at the top. It gives the different types of residential uses that are permitted. At the bottom, separated from there, you'll see secondary dwelling units. That description, that element, is found in the end of the use table because it is an accessory use. But as you go across the use table, I want to point out a few key provisions. When you look at it, you'll see single-family detached dwelling. That's permitted in the DA district, the DS district, D1, D2, D3, D4, D5, D5-2 district, and the D8 district. Those are the dwelling districts where it's permitted. If you go across a little further, you'll see it's also permitted in the new mixed-use 3 district. So those are the zoning districts where a single-family detached dwelling is permitted. The other thing you'll notice when looking at the single-family detached dwelling is that we have a V in the C1, C3, C4, and C5, the commercial districts. That V means it's permitted if the existing building has been vacant for 5 or more consecutive years, what we call the vacant provision. Going down a little further, you'll see those districts where the 2-family dwelling, or double, is permitted. And again, it goes across a range of dwelling districts, in this case from the D2 district up to and including the D8 district. Again, in the commercial districts, C1 through C5, it's permitted if the building's been vacant. It's also a permitted use in the mixed-use 3 district. Now you look next and you'll see the triplex or fourplex. These are permitted in a narrower range of dwelling districts. It starts with the D6 district, D6-2, D7, and D8 districts. Those are higher density dwelling districts, and we are allowing this new type of housing unit in those. Again, they are permitted in the commercial districts, C1 through C5, if the existing building's been vacant for 5 or more years. You'll also note that in the mixed-use district, triplexes and fourplexes are permitted in both the mixed-use 2 and mixed-use 3 district. When you go across this table, you'll also see the single-family attached dwelling, also known as townhouses or row houses. These are permitted in the D5-2 district, the D6 district, D6-2, D7, and D8 dwelling districts. Again, they are also permitted if an existing building's been vacant for 5 or more years in the C1, C3, C4, and C5 districts. They are also permitted in the mixed-use 2 and mixed-use 3 districts, as well as the CBD, Central Business District 2 and 3. The last one I want to point out in the primary uses is the live-work unit. That's that new type of combination of where you live and where you work. And you'll see this type of unit has a much narrower range of districts where it's permitted. It's permitted if an existing building's been vacant for 5 or more years. It's permitted in the C1 through C5 commercial districts. It's also permitted in all 4 of the mixed-use districts, and it's permitted in the CBD districts, all three of them. Finally, to look at on this table is the secondary dwelling unit. We'll talk more about this later, but I want you to note here what residential districts it's permitted in, and that's DA through D5-2, as well as D8, and it's also permitted as an accessory use in the mixed use 2 and mixed use 3 districts. So now you've got a picture of where these types of units are permitted. Again, when looking at the use table, always look at that right-hand column to see if there are any use-specific standards. In this case, there are. We'll talk about those in a second. This slide is meant to reinforce the vacant provision. Only an existing building, not a vacant lot, and the building must have been vacant for 5 or more years. We're in the process of creating the administrative rules for this provision. It's new and it's unique to Indianapolis. Now let's talk a little bit about the use-specific standards. The use-specific standards identify what additional regulations must be met for a given use. Now these use standards are in addition to those of the underlying basic zoning district as well. So you have to meet both. These use-specific standards are especially important when a use is permitted in a zoning district that typically and in the past would not have allowed that use. The use-specific standards provide some additional regulatory framework. So when you're thinking about a use, be it single-family, attached, or a double, always check for the use-specific standards. What you see before you now is an excerpt from the use-specific standards for these residential units that we've been talking about. The single-family detached. These use-specific standards are in there, and please note that these are permissive. We're saying that single-family detached dwellings that have an attached garage may also have a no-step entrance. This is trying to encourage greater livability in our single-family detached units. You'll see also at the bottom there are some two-family dwelling district use-specific standards. The key one to point out is that in the D2 and D3 districts, two-family dwellings are only permitted on corner lots. That's a continuation of a requirement we have in place now. Moving ahead in the use-specific standards, you'll note these for the triplexes and fourplexes. If you're putting them into an MU, mixed use 1, mixed use 2, or a mixed use 3 district, the primary entrance of every dwelling unit shall be oriented to and clearly visible from a public street frontage. You have to be able to see the entrances of the dwelling units from a public street frontage. This is a safety provision. You'll also note the single-family attached has use-specific standards. And that is, if you have two or more than 2 units along the same vertical plane, no more than 2 of those abutting townhomes may have the same front plane. That is to say, we want variation in the frontage so that you can distinguish different units. When you have an offset along the front plane, that has to be a minimum of a 3-foot offset between units. The additional provision is in the D52 district, where no more than 8 dwellings may be constructed in a structure. That is to say, you can have no more than 8 single-family attached dwellings in the D52 district along one common building. Lastly on this one, you'll note the live-work units. This is, as I said before, an all-new concept. As we get more experience with this, it'll become more familiar to the public and more familiar to developers. But the key thing in this use-specific standard is that the non-residential use must be owned or operated by the person that lives there, that resides in the dwelling unit. That's a key provision. You have to live there as well as operate the business. The second provision is that when you have these live-work units in mixed-use districts, or they go into a vacant building in a commercial district, the non-residential use is limited to the non-residential uses permitted in that same district. So you have to conform to the permitted non-residential uses in the zoning district where it's located. Now let's move on to the secondary dwelling unit. It does have a number of use-specific standards. This is a new provision in zoning for Indianapolis. This is something that was not permitted by right under the old ordinance. What emerged followed considerable discussion, public discussion, and we settled on these key provisions to regulate what is permitted in a secondary dwelling unit. Remember, this is a second unit. The key provision, it's limited to one secondary dwelling unit on a lot with a single-family detached dwelling. That's the only kind of primary building you can have with a secondary dwelling unit. This slide summarizes the key provisions. A, it's permitted only in the compact context area. You may recall from the first presentation, the compact context area is a mapped area of Indianapolis that shows where we have a more densely developed geography. It's characterized more often than not by linear or a grid street structure, smaller lots, a mix of uses, often served by alleys. It generally coincides with the parts of Indianapolis that were developed prior to World War II. So the only place where the secondary dwelling unit is permitted is in the compact context area. It's also permitted only on a lot with a single-family detached dwelling. The secondary dwelling unit must be separated from the primary building, and it must be located in a permitted accessory building. That means it has to be located in a structure that meets all of the setback requirements, as well as height standards, as well as total square footage. The size of a secondary dwelling unit is limited to 720 square feet. That size is smaller than any of the permitted dwelling units in the lower density single-family zoning districts. So this is the way of assuring that it is accessory or secondary to the primary unit. If you have one of these, you do have to provide one additional off-street parking space. Finally, the entrance to a secondary dwelling unit must be visible from a right-of-way. That right-of-way can be either a street, it can be an alley, but you have to be able to see the entrance to the secondary dwelling unit from a right-of-way. Again, this is a safety provision. When we talk about zoning districts, one of the key things in that delineation of different zoning districts are what we call the lot and building dimensions, or dimensional standards. These tell you where the structure or structures can be placed on a lot. How tall can they be? How large can they be? How much setback is required? These dimensional standards are now included in a single table. There's a separate table for dwelling districts. When looking for the dimensional standards, the lot and building dimensions, look in table 744-202-1 for the lower density residential dwelling districts. That's where you'll find the dimensional standards. Please note, some of these standards have changed, and we've added some new standards. And when reading these dimensional requirements, pay attention to whether the location is in the compact or in the metro context area, because there are differences across those two geographies. What you see before you now is that table, table 744-201-1. And you'll see the layout for it. Across the top, it shows the zoning district, DA through D8 in this part of the table. Along the left column, you'll see the standard, and they're divided into components. The first gives you the requirements for the lot. That shows you, for example, how large does the lot have to be? What's the minimum width of a lot? What's the minimum street frontage for that lot? You'll also see it shows what's the minimum required open space. We'll talk a little bit about these, particularly about open space. But these give you the requirements for the minimum lot size for single-family detached, a two-family dwelling unit. And you'll note these can differ across each of the zoning districts. You'll also see on this table the maximum height. This tells you how tall the primary building can be, how tall it can be if you have additional setback from the side yard. It also shows you the maximum height for an accessory building. In this case, for all the districts displayed before you now, the tallest an accessory building can be is 24 feet. That's essentially 2 stories. But in the DEA district, agricultural district, the accessory building can go up to 45 feet in height. The zoning districts also include some standards for how large the main floor area can be. And you'll see those in the last 2 rows of this table. Now you see before you additional elements in table 744-201-1. Again, it's the dwelling district zoning across the top, DA through D8. And along the left, you'll see the different standards. What's the total floor area? What is the required frontage if it's on a collector street, on a local street? You'll see these setback requirements differ depending on the type of street it's located on. You'll also see it can differ if it's on a cul-de-sac. It also shows you what the side yard setback requirements are. At the bottom of the table, you'll notice there's an additional listing of setback requirements. This is if the lot is located in the compact context area. So as I noted before, there can be a difference in the setback requirements depending on whether it's located in the metro context area or the compact context area. That's a key provision, and that's a key difference. One final point I want to make about these dimensional standards that you see in Table 744-201-1, and that is there are certain exceptions to these requirements. These dimensional standards provide the basic configuration. However, with single family and double units and triples and quads, there are some allowable exceptions to these dimensional standards. For example, for chimneys or patios or other minor residential features. To find those exceptions, you go to Table 744-204-1. That will give you in one place all the exceptions to any of the dimensional standards that you see before you in this part of the ordinance. So keep in mind there are some exceptions to these dimensional standards, and you want to check those in Table 744-204-1. One last thing I'd like to point out on this table is you'll see the D8 district has a note after it. And that's at the end of the table. And what that shows you is that these standards apply to a single family attached, or two-family dwelling in the D8 district. The D8 district is unique in that it explicitly allows both single family, doubles, single family attached, and multifamily. So keep in mind, these standards in this table apply to the single family attached, or doubles in the D8 district. So we've taken you through the dimensional standards. Those regulate, as I said, placement of the building, size of the building on a lot. But there are some important additional regulations that apply to single family attached, doubles, triples, and quads. We're going to go through the specific elements of these in the new ordinance. You see before you what we're going to cover. We're going to cover some important calculations. I'll highlight some of the changes in the parking requirements. We'll talk about personal gardens, personal livestock, fences, home occupations, and renewable energy. Let's talk now about open space in the dwelling districts. We made a number of changes to how open space is determined on those lots with single-family detached homes, single-family attached homes, doubles, triples, and quads. We've also changed the terminology and definitions from what we use in the current ordinance. We've also changed how to account for multiple accessory structures. Each of these are important changes, so we're going to talk about them in some detail. Each zoning district has a minimum open space requirement. And what that means is you have the lot area, and then you have buildings placed onto that lot. In each of the zoning districts, there is a minimum percentage of the lot that has to remain open. That is to say, there cannot be a building on it. In some districts, for example, say the D5 district, the minimum open space requirement is 60%. That means 60% of the lot has to be open. This helps control and regulate and prevent overbuilding on dwelling district lots. So each dwelling district, each zoning district has a minimum open space requirement. What we've done is we've fine-tuned how those are determined. And you see before you in the calculations section of the Indy Rezone, which is Chapter 740, we identify how you calculate open space. And please note number 3 in this listing. That shows you how we calculate open space in the DA districts, DS, D1, D2, D3, D4, D5, and D5-2 districts, and D8 districts where there's a single family or double. This calculation of open space, we note that open space equals uncovered open space. That is to say, it may not have a roof over it. So for example, if you have a porch that has a roof over it, that does not qualify as open space in these calculations. If you have in the backyard a shelter over your gazebo, over your picnic area, because it's covered, that area does not count as open space. So in item 4, we say in these districts, you calculate the open space by subtracting any covered area from the total lot area, and then divide by the lot area, and that gives you your open space ratio. I'll show you an example a little later that'll help clarify that. All of these formulas have key definitions. In this case, for the single-family districts that we're talking about, the key thing is covered open space. That does not count in what we call open space for the single-family districts. You'll also see below there an identification of what elements count towards it or don't count towards it. So when examining a site, know the zoning district, know the permitted open space. And let's now show you another aspect of open space. We've changed how we treat accessory buildings. Under the current old ordinance, we had a provision that said the sum of all the accessory buildings could not exceed the square footage of the primary building. That has changed. The footprint of accessory buildings plus the footprint square footage of the primary building, if those combined meet the open space requirement, it's now permitted. The other key provision is that we've retained is that any one accessory building must be smaller in footprint than the primary dwelling unit. So again, Each accessory building must be smaller than the footprint of the primary building, but the sum of the accessory buildings can exceed the primary building if you still meet the open space requirement. That's a key change. What you have before you now is an example. Let's say this is a single-family detached unit in a D5 dwelling district. The open space requirement is 60%. The gray area shows you what's in place now. There's a primary unit of 1,000 square feet, an existing garage that opens onto an alleyway that's 200 square feet. Somebody proposes to add a second garage that's 20 by 30 feet, 600 square feet. Does it meet the open space requirement? The lot area is 6,000. So you take 6,000 minus the sum of the buildings, the existing garage at 200 square feet, the existing primary unit at 1,000 square feet, plus the proposed garage of 600 square feet. Then divide that number by 6,000, multiply by 100, and the calculation shows that you have 70% open space on that lot. So you could construct that proposed additional garage. So how would it work if somebody's proposing a larger addition? Let's say they want to propose a 900 square foot garage. If they do, let's go through the calculation. You have a 900 square foot addition plus the 200 square foot existing garage. That means the sum of the accessory buildings would be 1,100 square feet. When you insert that into the calculation of open space, that 1,100 square feet plus the 1,000 square feet of the primary dwelling unit gives you a total building area of 2,100 square feet. When you put that into the calculation, the result is 65% open space. So you could do even a 900 square foot garage addition in this example, because even though the sum exceeds the size of the primary unit, you still meet the open space requirement. So these calculations of open space, particularly with respect to accessory buildings, it's changed from the past. It's an important change, but we think it'll add flexibility to our zoning ordinance and will reduce the requirement for some variances. So we've talked about the calculations. Now I'd like to briefly go through the parking changes. We are going to cover parking provisions in Indy Rezone in a separate session. But what I want to highlight in this session is we have changed the requirement for minimum off-street parking for single family, doubles, triples, and quads. In the current ordinance, the requirement had been 2 off-street spaces per dwelling unit. Under Indy Rezone, we have reduced that requirement to 1 off-space parking per dwelling unit. That's a change from what we have now. Again, we'll go into more detail on parking in a later session, but be aware that primary parking requirement has changed. Another change in Indy Rezone is how we treat personal gardens. What we've done is we've identified the personal garden as an accessory use. We've also indicated that it's permitted in every zoning district. Every classification, commercial, industrial, dwelling, all of them allow personal gardens. You'll see we do not make any restrictions on placement of these gardens. You can plant them anywhere. They do not supersede any landscaping requirements, but there are no restrictions on where you can place a personal garden. It's also important to note that under personal garden, that's where we address non-commercial beekeeping, personalized beekeeping. We address it in the personal garden use-specific standards. Now, when talking about a personal garden in conjunction with a single-family unit or double, this personal garden is distinctly different than a primary use that we call garden. That's where an entire lot is converted into a garden. This is different. If you're interested in that garden as a primary use, I recommend that you check that out separately in the definition of garden, look in the use table to see where it's permitted, and then look at garden as a primary use and its use-specific standards. But let's go back to the personal garden. We've provided a definition, and some of the key elements are it's for cultivation of vegetables, grasses, fruits, shrubs, or domesticated bees as an accessory use. It can't cover the entire lot, by a resident or occupant of the site. We do allow composting of on-site materials under personal garden. The definition does not include high weeds or grass. In other words, you can't grow everything real tall and say, it's my personal garden. This doesn't get you out of that requirement. The other thing is to emphasize it does not include farming or beekeeping for commercial purposes. This is growing fruits, vegetables for your own personal use. As with so many of the provisions, the use-specific standards are important. In this case, I noted earlier that we do not restrict where you can place the garden. However, because personal beekeeping is a part of the personal garden, there are some provisions that restrict where you can do personal beekeeping. The key thing is that they must be domesticated honeybees. And by right, you can have no more than 8 hives, and no beehive can be larger than 16 cubic feet. But you are allowed to have up to 8 hives. We've indicated that these personal beehives may be located on the ground or on the roof of a building with a permanent foundation. So you can place them on the ground or on the roof of a building. If they're located on the ground and the opening of the beehive faces an area on site or another lot that has an activity area, such as a walkway, play area, patio, if you have that, then a barrier must be provided that causes the bee flight path to be directed upward at least 6 feet above the area. This is a safety precaution so that as bees are coming in and out of the hive, they have to fly high enough and away from any activity area. Another accessory use that is permitted in some districts is what we've labeled personal livestock. This is in response to a growing challenge we face in the dwelling districts. More and more people are raising rabbits, chickens, ducks, smaller animals for their personal use, be it for eggs or for food. The current ordinance has considerable ambiguity in terms of what's permitted and what's not permitted. Because more and more people are doing it, it's emerging as a zoning issue. And when we went through the public phase of creating Indy Rezone, this is a topic that generated a strong reaction from that segment of the population that does currently raise personal livestock in their dwelling units. What we have established is that personal livestock is a permitted accessory use, but only for single-family detached units and doubles. It's not a permitted accessory use for triples or quads or single-family attached units. It's limited to the single-family detached and doubles. And that's so we can firmly establish who owns these animals. Now, because more and more people are already doing this, as we enact Indy Rezone, we may face some potential issues with the grandfathering of this use. The grandfathering means I was doing it before, I'm legally established, even though the ordinance has changed. We've included some provisions that we think will help with this grandfathering issue. What you see before you now is the definition of personal livestock. As with so much of the ordinance, the definition is a key starting point. We've identified personal livestock as poultry, rabbits, sheep, donkeys, mules, alpacas, llamas, horses, and goats. We've delineated what's included in our definition of personal livestock. They may be standard size, miniature, pygmy, or dwarf, but the other key element is that they are for the use by the resident or occupant of the property. Our personal livestock definition excludes domestic dogs and cats, and it does not include animals associated with a business activity, such as farming or if you board animals. Personal livestock is for use by the resident or occupant of the property. What you see before you now are the use-specific standards. And when you look at them in the ordinance, you'll see there are a number of use-specific standards. You need to read through these very carefully. The key one is it is limited to single-family detached or two-family dwelling units. We say the caretaker or owner of the animal must reside on the same lot as the animal. We've identified what are permitted. We've put them into categories. We've indicated what's the maximum number of adult animals that are allowed, and for some types of animals, we've indicated a minimum lot size. You see that in Table 743-306-3. You'll note that we've limited, for example, chickens and quails, pigeons, and ducks. We're saying the maximum number of adult animals allowed on a lot is 12, but there's no minimum lot size. This contrasts with, say, miniature equine, horses, donkeys, or mules, limited to two adult animals, and the minimum lot size is 1 acre. Now, what happens in the case of someone who's been doing a good job and raising more than that number of animals on their dwelling lot now? What can we do? Look at provision number 3. What we're establishing is a personal livestock license, a personal livestock license that will indicate a person has demonstrated the capacity to raise more than the maximum allowed number of animals on their lot, and they can get permission to do so. They will not have to go through the variance process. This license will supersede these stated maximums. Now, we're still putting together the details on this, but we think this provision will allow people the option of demonstrating, we've already done it before, we want to have more animals than are allowed under the new ordinance, and here's a way for them to accommodate that provision. Some of the other use-specific standards deal with things of housing of the animals, disposing of waste, provision of water, if in some instances, if they are slaughtering animals. We do regulate that. So we now have provisions on the number of personal livestock animals you can have, as well as how they must be housed and treated in a dwelling district. A key point to make is this does not apply to farming operations on a DA site, dwelling agriculture. This does not apply to them. Another aspect of single-family homes is often the fence. Many homes do include fences. We've made some changes in how we regulate fences in these single-family districts. You see before you provision in Table 744, so that's in Chapter 744, Article 5, Section 10. That's where you'll find the fencing regulations. We do indicate that wood, stone, or brick, or wrought iron is the permitted. We also do allow chain link fencing. That's identified in the table you see before you now, what districts allow it. We have made some changes in terms of maximum heights. In the dwelling districts, the maximum height in the front yard is 3.5 feet or 42 inches. Now, what we've done is we've added a new provision, and it says that in the front yard you can go to 4 feet in height if the fencing has an opacity of 30% or less. That means if the openness of the fence is at least 70%, so predominantly open, you can have a 4-foot high fence in the front yard. That's a change from in the past. The maximum height in the side and rear yards has stayed the same at 6 feet. Another key change that I want to point out is we've had a long-standing exception to fence height in the current ordinance, and in it, it relates to different development districts within the city. We've eliminated those, and now the exceptions follow, the permitted exceptions follow the compact context area. So if a property is located in the compact context area, they are allowed the listed exceptions to the fence heights. So the change is not in the exception, but we're using the compact context area map to delineate where this exception applies. An additional change in the fence regulations deals with those atypical instances that you see displayed. And that's a case where a lot actually goes through to two different streets. It has frontage on two different streets. In the past, that has created issues because in this example, the area on the right is the backyard of that primary dwelling unit. And under the ordinance, they could have a 6-foot fence in their backyard. But it fronts onto another street, and on either side, it's the front yard of those lots. This created some problems. So what we've done is we've added a provision that if you have the atypical circumstance of a through lot, that is to say frontage on two streets, the area that is adjacent to the backyard but extends beyond the established building line, you cannot have a 6-foot fence there. You are limited to a 3.5-foot fence to make it similar to the front yards along that entire street frontage. That's a new provision. We think this will help a lot. Another permitted accessory use in single family, doubles, triples, quads, are home occupations. This is different from live-work units. This is where you can work out of your home, but it is still essentially a residential unit. As things have changed over the last 20-25 years, we've needed to update our definition to reflect the current range of home-based occupations. So that's been included in Indy Rezone. As I said, it's a permitted accessory use in the dwelling districts, but it does have some use-specific standards. As is often the case, it starts with the definition. We've modified the definition to include some more contemporary functions. For example, therapy, architecture. We've also included web design or computer services, music instruction. This is a more inclusive list of permitted occupations. The key thing is it must be a person that resides in the unit. I'll now go through some of the use-specific standards. Again, always look for the use-specific standards. Key things: the primary use of the dwelling unit shall remain residential. The home occupation must be incidental and subordinate. You cannot use more than 600 square feet or 30% of the total square footage of the dwelling unit in that occupation. So there's a limit to the amount of space that can be used for the home occupation. You have to maintain the residential integrity of the unit. Number 9 is a new provision that restricts no more than 4 individuals simultaneously to the housing unit for that home occupation. We're trying to set parameters and set a limit to how many people can be coming to the home for this occupation. At number 15, you'll see we've added and modified the limitations on who may work with the home occupant. That is to say, you can have a service. If you have a dentist's office, for example, you can have an assistant working there. And what we've done is we've said you can have no more than 2 non-resident assistants. and there are some limitations to when those non-resident assistants can be there. Limited to 45 hours per week, and if you have more than one home occupation in the same dwelling unit, only one of them may utilize a non-resident assistant. So we've added some important regulations, some important parameters that guide home occupations. It's one of the longer sections for use-specific standards. So if you have a home occupation, be sure to read these and read them carefully. When we provided the overview of Indy Rezone, we noted that one of the new provisions is that we are explicitly acknowledging renewable energy facilities in our zoning ordinance. The old ordinance was silent on these, but many new options have emerged over the years, and we wanted to make it clear that this is a permitted accessory use in the single-family dwelling districts. Renewable energy facilities are permitted as an accessory use. And so we start with the definitions. We define what kind of solar and geothermal facilities are permitted, what kind of wind facilities. We're making it clear these are permitted, but they have some use-specific standards. For example, solar and geothermal facilities may only be located in the side and rear yards or on a rooftop. If they're on a rooftop, you may exceed the maximum height limitation for a building by up to 18 inches. So they can extend above the maximum height, but by no more than 18 inches. For the wind facilities, again, they must be located in the rear yard or on a rooftop. If they're located on a rooftop, these wind facilities, the wind turbines, may exceed the maximum building height by no more than 10 feet. These are relatively small structures, and so they do need to be in the wind, so we do allow them to extend above the maximum allowable building height. Finally, what I'd like to talk briefly about are the DA, the dwelling agricultural districts. We've added some special provisions. We want to emphasize what we're trying to do is we're trying to accommodate conventional farming operations in Indianapolis. We're trying to encourage the continuation of these farming operations. So we've included in the Indy Rezone some specific elements that will make it clear agricultural operations are permitted. When we talked about the different zoning districts, Chapter 742, we indicated that some of the districts have what we call other standards that are unique to that district. DA is one of these. So look in Chapter 742, Article 103, for these particular standards that are unique to the agricultural uses. And we have some use-specific standards for agriculture, and you'll find those in Chapter 744, 304A. Want to make sure we're aware of those. Another thing that we've done in the use-specific standards, we've identified what they can do and that they are less restricted than might be implied from the zoning regulations. For example, you can grow things, you can raise the animals, but we are limiting how they can be transformed in the DA district. We're making that distinction between growing and raising for food products as opposed to final treatment of those products for marketing purposes. There are some differences. We've also made it clear that if you have a lake or a pond on the agricultural site, you cannot include commercial or recreational activities that you charge the general public a fee. That's a limitation. But we do have some special dimensional standard exceptions. Those are identified in the DEA use-specific standards. So pay attention to those. We've also made clear what some of those exceptions are. This is, again, still in the use-specific standards, but we make it clear that you can do certain operations without limit. For example, accessory structures, barns and silos, those can exceed the height limitations. They can be larger than the primary structure. We make it clear that that's permitted. However, if you do anything with the concentration of cattle, swine, or poultry, there are limitations and requirements of separation from other dwelling units. So that's important to note. One final use-specific standard that I want to highlight is that we clearly and unambiguously do not allow confined feeding operations or concentrated animal feeding operations in Marion County. Those are not allowed. This last slide shows how we do explicitly allow exceptions for agricultural structures. That is to say, silos, accessory buildings, barns, livestock sheds. They can be, the height limitations do not apply if they are in that agricultural use. So in combined, we think all these provisions make it clear that we do want and do allow the continued operation of agricultural enterprises within Indianapolis. That concludes this presentation on single-family dwelling units. Again, to highlight, we now have a broader range of single-family dwelling unit types. We've changed where they are allowed. We've made some adjustments to the dimensional standards. We've added new use-specific standards, particularly for permitted accessory uses that you should be aware of. And we've made it clear we are allowing the continuation of agricultural enterprises in Indianapolis. Thank you for listening, and please look forward to the additional presentations on more detailed topics within Indy Rezone.